This week, we talk with Guru Pandurangi from Cloudneeti. In the news segment, side channels come front and center. AppSec scales up while DevOps speaks out, and more. Stay tuned for Application Security Weekly.
This is a Security Weekly production. Signal Sciences secures the most important web applications, APIs, and microservices of the world's leading companies, protecting over 7,500 applications and 150 billion production requests per week. Signal Sciences Next-Gen WAF and RASP help companies increase security and maintain site reliability without sacrificing velocity, all at the lowest total cost of ownership. Signal Sciences patented technology protects any application against any attack, with integrations into any DevOps toolchain. Signal Sciences, demand more from your WAF. Learn more at signalsciences.com/PSW.
Application Security Weekly. This is episode 69, recorded July 15th, 2019. I'm your host, Mike Shima, and I'm here with Matt Alderman.
Happy Monday.
Happy Monday, Matt. And we've also got John Kinsella, as always.
Hey guys, how you doing?
Hey, John. Register for our upcoming webcasts with ISC Squared and Security Weekly's Evaluating Security Vendors Without Losing Your Mind by going to securityweekly.com/webcasts. If you have missed any of our previously recorded webcasts, you can find our on-demand library at securityweekly.com/on-demand. Security Weekly is returning to Vegas this August for Black Hat and DEF CON. If you would like to request a briefing or sponsor an interview on site at Black Hat, please go to securityweekly.com/booking and submit your request. Guru Pandurangi is a founder and CEO of Cloudneeti, a software as a service company focused on continuous cloud security, data privacy, and compliance assurance. Guru has 20 years of professional experience, a good portion of it as an early adopter of cloud technologies and building global-scale cloud products like Windows Live, Bing Platform, consumer identity, and federations. He is passionate about helping businesses accelerate their cloud adoption by proactively managing security and compliance posture in their public cloud infrastructure. Hi, Guru. Thanks for joining us today. So let's start off with, we have a premise here where DevOps teams are building apps in the cloud, and they've greatly benefited from the flexibility and speed that on-demand services, on-demand systems can give them. So, I'll assert here that a cloud infrastructure has all the components for secure architecture and all the potential misconfiguration chances for a breach notification. So, Guru, how do we make this better, especially when we throw in more than one cloud into the mix that DevOps teams want to play with?
Absolutely. First of all, thank you for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to be here on a call with you, with Matt, with John, and it's wonderful. It's wonderful. Thank you for that question. I think that's probably a leading question around, how is the market changing, and what is Cloudneeti doing towards that? Cloudneeti, as you probably might be aware, we are into infrastructure, cloud security, and compliance posture management. Gartner also puts us into what's referred as CSPM, or cloud security posture management, or cloud security assurance in general. And we are focusing primarily on the infrastructure risks, right, and eliminating that, and as part of when customers are migrating their workloads to the public cloud, right? That's a little brief about what Cloudneeti does.
Yeah, it's interesting to talk about the infrastructure because, we talk a lot about application security, and that might pull in things like the OWASP top 10, those classic types of problems. But when we go to the cloud, infrastructure and application layer, we could kind of describe maybe that they should be, well, I don't know if they should be different. Maybe we've talked about how they are different, or different teams have tended to pay attention to them. But like I mentioned, misconfigurations are just one example of the classic S3 bucket problem that cloud deployments run into. So what do you see, or how do you approach that from describing what the infrastructure challenges are for teams that are moving into the cloud from a security perspective?
That's a great question. So let us kind of maybe take a step back around, in general, how the customers are really approaching taking their workloads to the public cloud, right? Traditionally you had these mode one operators who would take their, would stand up the infrastructure in the public cloud and then go ahead and deploy apps, right? And you refer that in the last 4 or 5 years as mostly the CI/CD pipeline or the app pipeline, if you will, on the CI/CD processes. Uh, but about but that's not very scalable systems. Apps and infrastructure, they tend to move along and iterate much more rapidly together, right? So you're right. Is app and infrastructure any different in the public cloud? Well, in the public cloud, they are kind of merging together, right? So these days, you're finding the CI/CD pipelines or the continuous integration and continuous delivery pipelines to be merged for both the app and the infrastructure artifacts. We've seen a lot of in the last 3 to 4 years. Most MSPs who Gartner called it as Mode One MSPs who would go click, 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 stand up the infrastructure, and then go ahead and deploy apps. They were losing steam, right? So the newer MSPs that came in, they started building the entire app and the infrastructure pipeline jointly, and they created the agility towards releasing those bits to the public cloud. So I think we certainly tend to believe that app and infrastructure in the public cloud are no different, right? They are together. The security paradigms on it might be slightly different, right? As you rightly mentioned, the misconfigurations that happen, mostly happen on the infrastructure side, right? You have the same the app security problems that could lead to like the Apache threats framework or the JavaScript errors or the user behavior problems or the static analysis, dynamic analysis that still exists, that still need to be maintained. But as Gartner, is slowly starting to come around and start recommending that most or nearly all successful attacks that have happened in the last 3 to 4 years' time, at least the public domain information, that has resulted from primarily cloud misconfigurations, mismanagement, or human errors or human mistakes. Most of them were preventable, right? So, which is why there's a left shift that's happening towards not investing a lot more on the SecOps part of it, but pull that in from the prevention and the DevSecOps standpoint. I hope that makes sense.
Guru, I think a lot of this stems from the fact that everything is software defined. I'm defining my cloud infrastructure, my application, my Kubernetes configuration. Mm-hmm. Everything's becoming software defined. And when it becomes software defined, it falls more into the developer's realm than it did in the traditional IT or SecOps disciplines.
No, exactly, right? And which is why I think these days when you create the CI/CD pipeline, there's this notion of infrastructure as code. Well, that notion existed for the last 4 to 5 years, but maybe in the last 2 years or so, it's become much more prominent that Azure's released Azure Blueprints. AWS released various quick start guide, which is both the CloudFormation templates and the app code together, right? So this notion of software define everything, right? Infrastructure is code, right? Policies are code, and app is code. So combining that into a joint artifacts actually, makes more sense. But there's only about we believe only about 10 to 15% of the market has pivoted towards that, right? The rest of the market is still kind of the mode one operator. Somebody would go stand up infrastructure, stand up virtual machines, or even we've seen the cases where they're standing up Kubernetes clusters, and then they have the CI/CD pipeline just deploying the apps. That doesn't make sense, but that's where they start, especially if they are coming in from infrastructure or, infrastructure as a service or VM-based, profiles. It definitely doesn't exist on the PaaS kind of profiles, right? We've seen that on Azure standpoint, or maybe even in case of AWS and Google, the moment they start using RDS or S3 buckets, or for that matter, SQL databases, NoSQL databases, and so on and so forth, right? That needs to be created through APIs or infrastructure as code. So this notion that whether there's a mode one operator and a mode two operator is slowly kind of coming to the close. And we believe that, it has to be together, or else you really can't gain efficiencies.
Yeah, and there's got to be a good, compelling reason to make, say, infrastructure as code can be potentially more secure because you can actually also read it and understand it. So, cloud environments, I would hope, still give us, a better visibility rather than into how you're using the what you've deployed, rather than that you're kind of mentioning that lift and shift approach where sure someone might be deployed in the cloud, but if they're actually not taking advantage of the actual cloud capabilities, they're not going to get those benefits.
You're right. So let's take a simple example of the S3 buckets that you mentioned about, right? The likes of you have the U.S. U.S. government being hacked. Amazon was hacked itself, right? You had Facebook using AWS S3 buckets was hacked. Department of Justice has been hacked, right? And so forth, right? Most of these cases, have been associated with misconfigured S3 buckets or misconfigured databases or misconfigured virtual machines, right? All of these were successful attacks on the public cloud infrastructure. When you take a look at how are these getting configured, right? Again, S3 buckets have policies. Now, if you take those policies and deploy that as part of your infrastructure as code pipelines, right? They tend to be readable, of course, right? You're able to put compliance or governance around it on what are my organization policies and which ones I'm complying to. Right? Sometimes people don't understand how S3 bucket compliance or exposure, can lead to that compliance. But that's a different story, right? But now that you have a case where all the policies are now part and parcel of your version control of your code pipelines, right? Which means that you can go ahead and incrementally add more complexity to it, right? Of course, you can go ahead and create a very hardened S3 bucket policy or a RDS, services policy or SQL database policy and say, hey, I want to start with this baseline and then start poking holes into it. Like, you can create firewall rules, on addition, on top of that hardened policies. So now that they are just not readable. They essentially can now comply to your internal organizational standards, right? And of course, it allows you to say that there's a business unit one who created this new standards for using S3 buckets or RDS buckets, but a new business unit or a new app that's migrating to the public cloud, that doesn't have to be left behind, right? You can take the same code base or the same policy governance frameworks and apply that to the new app as well. So inherently, you're not just applying security policies across the board. It's becoming more and more easier for you to prevent attacks. Right now, what's the surface area or the exposure area to it is, right? And on top of it, compliance becomes easy. So infrastructure is as code is probably what I would refer to as the best thing beyond the sliced bread. But I think that's where the CI/CD pipelines go. That's where the DevSecOps principles start becoming much more meaningful.
So what is it then, as we start to move up to the application layer, if we're talking about prevention, detection, how does that start to become a bit more fuzzy? So where does that, where do you see more of those challenges for those DevOps teams or those AppSec teams to come in and help out?
Yeah, I think there are two trends that at least we are seeing, and then I think Mike and the audience, you can also refer us back as you look to this video, right? The first trend that we are seeing is that cloud service providers, be it Amazon or AWS or Google, they are building security services natively within their product lines. Right now, you have things like WAF, right, which is again AWS is offering a version of WAF, right? Azure is offering 2 or 3 versions of WAF. Google's offering 1 or 2 versions of WAF. So WAF is becoming part and parcel of your deployment or infrastructure as code, meaning that you don't have to have one single WAF for all of your apps together anymore, right? You can have small, digitally controlled WAF just for your app, right? And you can have only specific set of policies associated to it. And how do you create it? You stand that up as part of your infrastructure pipeline, right? So the first time you deploy, you stand up WAF, you open holes through it, you configure various OWASP policies that are associated either preventative or detection controls, and then you connect that back to your app. The moment you do that, right, now you have very micro WAF, right, associated to each of your apps. Now that blurs the line between, where does app security when it comes to OWASP top 10 beat third party like Signal Sciences or or somebody else like Imperv or somebody else needs to bring in, right? Now they're competing directly against the cloud providers WAF. Same is the case with DDoS protection, right? Now you don't have to necessarily always have to think about that I have to use DDoS protection from Akamai or Cloudflare or somebody like that, right? You can start off saying that, hey, I'm getting some DDoS protection from AWS Shield or Azure DDoS standard protections and so on and so forth. If there's any incremental changes or any things that the cloud providers they themselves don't provide, right? You're getting that from a CSP at about maybe most of the times less than 10% of the cost, right? So you're now getting bundled that as part of your standard compute and database infrastructure. So security services are now getting bundled as part of that. So where does that line blur, right? If you have to go and say that I need OWASP top 10 protection, right? Signal Sciences versus AWS WAF, which one should I choose, right? The first one will take some time because of procurement, because of trying out various pilots. But you can go click, 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 and stand up WAF and try it out, right? So the lines are blurring between third-party vendors and first-party vendors. That's number one. Number two, right? The first-party vendors, which are AWS and Azure and so on and so forth, you can stand that up with just like standing S3 buckets, right? Or any other virtual machines or EC2 infrastructure, right? Again, as part of infrastructure as code. So that makes it much more much more interesting from a CI/CD pipeline, from a release management standpoint.
So what about then? Go ahead.
Oh, sorry, Mike. A couple points, right? I mean, at Gartner Security and Risk, Gartner kind of said, hey, security vendors, pure plays, look out. Here come the cloud providers, right?
Correct.
This is something I've been saying for almost 5 years now, is that over time, the cloud providers would bring more security capabilities into their infrastructure, make it easy to use at a much better price point, and we're starting to see that really come to fruition here in the last year or two. On point one. On point two now, now what you've got is this really interesting opportunity, Guru, of platform as a service tied with certain security capabilities to start to bring things together. And I think that's really easy if you're single cloud. What I want to know is, if you're not single cloud, now what? Because I think the multi-cloud dimension of this gets really interesting, because now I've got to manage these platforms and these security solutions from a couple different cloud providers. How does that come back together at some point to be centrally managed across this diverse multi-cloud infrastructure?
Yeah, that's very interesting. So I think you probably were at the Gartner conference. So we were, and Matt, the other Matt from Gartner, he essentially stated there are 5 big things as big takeaways from a CSP standpoint, right? You have providers like CWPP or Cloud Workload Protection Platforms. That's most likely going to still stay on as third-party vendors, right? CSPM vendors like Cloudneeti, still stays as multi-cloud vendors. But when it comes to network protection, right, when it comes to vulnerability management, right, and so forth, right, it is becoming more and more inherent to the cloud providers themselves. So typically, I think what we have seen, at least very recently, that if an enterprise is going on a journey for a multi-cloud provider, right, and there are, let's say, 3 different teams. One is a business unit 1, which is building apps for AWS. Another is business unit 2, which is building apps for Azure. And then there's a CISO team, which sits within either reporting to CIO, the CTO, or the risk officers, right? They are looking at centralized visibility across all of their cloud platforms or their cloud workload. They have a problem, right? They can't really get centralized viewpoints. Most of the times when AWS is into the mix, they'll be promoting their own monitoring tools, right? Their own security tools, right? And Azure is going to say the same. In fact, Azure has now also promoted an Azure SIEM, which is a native SIEM for Azure, right? So where does this really, I think this is a transition time in the next 2 to 3 years' time, right? This is a transition time when all of the third-party providers are still, have their own moats, if you will, right? So they have their own domains, the likes of Splunk, the likes of Logarithm, right? They still have their own moats, right, on multi-cloud platforms. But that eventually will erode away, right? With Azure bringing their own SIM, which becomes multi-cloud. AWS will bring their own SIM, most likely, again, multi-cloud, right? So whichever direction that you go, we are sensing that, log analytics or SIM providers, network providers, vulnerability management, and many such such correlative aspects will become more and more native, right? And they will be more transitive. Azure and AWS will have products which will interoperate, right? From a data standpoint, from a log standpoint, and so on and so forth. But then there are third-party providers, right, which is the CSPM or the compliance assurance or the, I think even the threat management part of it is going to be native, right? So would you need another threat management product, which is a third-party run? It will pivot only to Azure and not pivot to AWS? And probably not. You'll most likely use a threat protection, threat detection mechanism inherently built into Azure, AWS, or Google at 10% of the cost, right? So more and more of that market will move towards that. There is only about a sliver of 5 to 6 different providers, as Gartner stated, right, which will likely, remain as third-party multi-cloud. Hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, it does, and I think that's the interesting part, is that only a certain set of vendors that can hybridize across multi-clouds are probably the guys that still win in this space, I guess.
I think so, and that's what Gartner, Gartner had 2 sessions talking about where the CSPs are going and what are the threats to the third-party ecosystem. And they clearly mentioned there are 6 categories, and I don't remember all of them yet. There are 6 categories which include like network management, vulnerability management, be it SIM or be it log analytics or sometimes even SOAR, right? SOAR has a capability of an event being generated and something being, something tracks it, responds to it. Those are becoming more and more native to the cloud providers, right? So all of that segment, slowly is becoming more and more CSP friendly, right? Or done in the first party itself. That probably, is where, the likes of a third-party WAF, right, like Signal Sciences, or network providers, be it Checkpoint, Firewall, Palo Alto, and so on and so forth. We believe that over a period of time, right, they will have still have a large market presence because of the on-prem world, which is not moving down, right, as fast. Maybe it is growing at a 10 to 12% tick. But the newer workloads will be on the public cloud, and customers might choose to use it as an Azure firewall, right, or for that matter, an AWS firewall, much more easier because now they are also interoperable, right? You can go to AWS firewall and say, hey, export my Palo Alto configurations and import it in AWS firewall, right? So there are tool sets that are available like that. Same is the case with Azure. So that we are right. I think we believe that we are right now in the transition period where most of these cloud services, earlier referred as network and security cloud services, are becoming first party. What remains outside of that is things like antiviruses, things like CSPM providers, companies like us, right, and so on and so forth. So those will continue to be third party providers.
I'm going to be a bit of a push back a little bit here on this, Guru.
Oh, great.
So, excuse me. As I'm listening to you guys talk, one of the things which comes into my mind is, anytime any startup goes into a VC, one of the first questions they're going to get asked if they're doing something in this type of space, right, is, well, what are you going to happen when Amazon gets into this, right? And there's a lot of startups out there which have survived pretty well so far. So that's sort of the first point. It's the small, nimble startup is always going to have some sort of a, an advantage, right? They're a little hungrier and they got different ways of thinking about things. And I think there's always going to be a cat and mouse there. So I'm curious to hear you talk about that. But before we go there, another sort of data point for you. Here where I am at the day job, I'd say, even with my little section of the world, once a month I've got a potential customer who's like saying, hey, we scanned a container with your product, we scanned a container with someone else. The results are different. Why, right? And so think about, just look at ignore what else and just say Azure and Amazon, there's always going to be difference in those products. So from my point of view, if I was looking at this operationally, I think I would rather have a third-party product which would actually give me a standardized view which I could trust would be consistent across different platforms. So have you had people, customers push back around that, or any comments around this type of stuff?
Yes. I mean, what you're referring is the state today, right? Let's say if CNCF, the Cloud Native Computing Foundations, comes up with an API layer which is much more secure, right? And now that's adopted by Azure, AWS, and Google, and so on and so forth. What prevents all of these first-party providers to provide that consistent view? Today, that doesn't exist, which is why companies like Tigera or Aqua or Twistlock, right, have varying nature of Kubernetes scanning services, right, or Kubernetes vulnerability management, and so on and so forth. Even the CIS community, the Center for Internet Security, various CIS benchmarks associated to Kubernetes, they are continuously in flux, right? It is not standardized yet, right? As opposed to what happened on AWS and Azure or virtual machine-based, benchmarks. So Kubernetes benchmarks are constantly in flux, and we are part and parcel of that. We are one of the authors associated with it. So we see that the market is still in the transition. The state that you're mentioning is right now, right? But think about it maybe 5 years down the line, 6 years down the line, when network provisions are built inside of Kubernetes, right? Today they are not, right? If any pods want to talk to another pod, you essentially need to make all the pods talk to each other. There's no other way to manage like security groups, right, on AWS or on Azure. But those controls will come in. That's part and parcel of the CNCF next level proposal, which will get integrated into the Kubernetes frameworks and so on and so forth. And come to think of it, right, Kubernetes is still in about version 3 or version 4, right? It will take another maybe 3 or 4 versions for it to have a standardized Kubernetes, security layer, if you will, which now applies both to on-prem world to the cloud world, right? And I think that's the time when things will be much, much different. But you're absolutely right today. Today you scan your Kubernetes cluster, or for that matter, your AWS scans versus from one provider to another provider are very different, right? But that's the case today. But it will take some time for it to catch up.
Hey, John, I was going to comment on the VC side, right? I mean, you're right, because the VCs are looking for the innovation, but we all know that if Amazon wants to do something, they're going to lock resources away, and 6 months later they're going to come out with a product, right? And it's all a timing issue, I think, at this point. But from our past experience, we know that if these guys want to build it, they can build stuff pretty quickly. They have the resources and the money to do it. I think that is a challenge for some of the startups in the space that are trying to be funded. You really have to think about differentiation here, and how do you survive a single cloud provider from doing it themselves, and how do you continue to survive if that happens? Those are the things I think startups have to answer longer term in the cloud space.
I'll agree with you to a bit, right? But I think if you look at most of the products, which, well, let's be, love Amazon, but let's talk about them for a second. Most of the products which they've come out with aren't really fully fleshed out. There's a lot of betas. There's a lot of just enough. There's a lot of, so I imagine, I haven't touched their SIM yet, or I think we're talking about the Microsoft one, but I'm guessing there's going to be a lot of edge cases. I'm guessing on Amazon, the documentation is going to be weak. I'm guessing that there are going to be a few little bumps here and there. So I think there's always going to be a chance for someone else to come along and either do a better user experience, better, all sorts of sort of ways you can actually make a better product. And I don't think, I mean, yes, if Amazon wants to get into that space, they'll make something which is good enough, and that's going to keep a lot of customers happy. I guess the question comes down to what percentage of that is out there, and will those third parties still be able to work with Cloudneeti and some things like this? Probably yes, but I'm not just going to accept that they're going to steamroll away with everything.
Yeah, so I have a thought to it, right? So if you draw a normal distribution curve, right, around the market adoption around these products, let's take an example of Azure Firewall or an AWS Firewall, right? Their price points and price to feature ratio is very, very compelling. But the number of features that they have and the number of controls that the customer has, the user experience is not all that great. So there is going to be that mean segment, right, which is that long tail when people are concerned about costs, and mid-sized customers and small customers, they will tend to adopt more and more of native cloud services, right? And over a period of time, right, it's very likely that most of these native services will be more or less the basic version of what really a third-party product could be, right? And that could be the place where third-party products will either need to beat the market, beat the AWS or the Azure providers from a feature standpoint. Number two, they have to be much better from a user experience standpoint. And number three, they have to work across multi-cloud, and that's a very difficult proposition. For any new startup to come in and say, hey, that we are now a multi-cloud provider, right? We are beyond the better versions of the basic versions of AWS and Azure, and this is what we can do, right? So there won't be a lot of these startups who will come through. There will be many startups who will come and say that I will do a great job at it on AWS or Google or Azure, and they will get bought in, right, by the larger provider who will try to assimilate and integrate that. So the market will probably consolidate more and more towards a new startup will come in, right? Let's say a new startup comes in and say, hey, we will do the best threat protection out there, right? But we can only do it for Azure because Azure is very different than AWS. Somebody will come, we will do the best threat protection for AWS, right? With hardly people, a team of about less than 100 people, you can only really do a good job at one or two of the cloud providers. You can't do it at 3 or 4. So what will really happen is after some time, these startups will get bought over at multiple values to, let's say, a large network provider who wants to become a cloud player, right? We believe that's the way it is going, which is where Palo Alto, which was a traditional network company, started buying Twistlock, right? Bought PureSec, right? Redlock and Evident.io, right? And why? When you take the layers of the onion, right? The network business is slowly, the CAGR is reducing at a faster tick than the cloud services themselves. So yeah, I think it's a balancing act, a transition act, if you will.
When I'm listening to this too, we've been talking about WAFs, for example, but also, some of my concerns would be, a lot of them would be around simple identity and access management, as well as just managing encryption keys. So maybe one cloud vendor can give me the tools to see that well, but if we're looking at the security of different teams who've decided to go multi-cloud, or these different teams are going in different clouds, I still want to be able to have a unified way of understanding what looks good. And I think maybe that kind of points to what John was saying about, we'll scan a container with tool A, then scan it with tool B, and some things come back slightly differently. But even more directly about that IAM and that encryption layer, how much of these cloud service providers will do this for us? But I'm pretty sure they're not going to AWS isn't going to reach into Azure and give recommendations, right?
Yeah, you're probably right? So I think maybe to Mike, your point and to John's point, what if, right? Let me ask this question much more broadly. What if the next generation of startups who come in, right, instead of reinventing a wheel, assuming that they don't want to reinvent the wheel of creating a new cloud HSM, right, that works well on Azure or AWS. Instead, they become an aggregator. They build an awesome UX, which is providing the least common denominator. And behind the scenes, the customer just has to say, I want to use Azure, or I want to use AWS or Google, or all of them, right? So this third-party ecosystem now builds an API layer, which is now standardized, and behind the scenes, it federates or syndicates across various cloud providers, right? I believe that's the next class of startups that will come in, which become an aggregator platforms rather than standing up a new, let's say, an encryption mechanism which works only on one cloud provider. They would rather use the native tool sets, right, and provide that aggregation UI, right, for the enterprises who need that aggregation, right? So they would be like that, and on top of it, they would provide for much more governance scenarios, right? So managing keys on Azure is very different than managing keys on AWS. You still need a proper governance mechanism on approvals, on workflows, and so on and so forth, which don't exist right today with the native cloud providers. which is where I think you become an aggregator plus add a governance layer on top of it. Allows for that standardized control that you're talking about. Is that a fair way to think that you may not necessarily have to go build in maybe another 5 years down the line your own threat provider, right? Your own threat detection or prevention mechanisms. You'll use the native threat prevention. AWS has Guard Duty, right? And Azure has Azure Security Center, and Google has their own command center for threat detection. You'd use that, right? And have an aggregator control that, hey, these are all the threats that are across your public cloud. These are all the standardized alerts coming in from native cloud providers, and then that goes into your Splunk or your SIM systems or your source systems and so on and so forth. So aggregation becomes a much more important play at that time, right? Rather than creating a single pane of glass and building your own technologies at that time. Maybe that's another levels of startups that might come in.
We already see aspects of that with, I think, what Google's going to do with Chronicle and go after the other cloud providers and provide support. I think Google said, look, we're going to figure out how to work with all the cloud providers. And, that's going to be their niche, I think, is what they're going to try to carve out for themselves. And look, somebody could do that. And if they've got Chronicle, which is going to aggregate a lot of this data and kind of be that next generation SIM in the cloud, but they're also taking data from AWS and Azure and GCP is all part of that. You just built your aggregator model just like that.
Yeah, I think we certainly see that, right? We've seen that same trend with Azure Security Center, right? So you can now do virtual machine threat protection, regardless of whether it's a virtual machine on-prem or EC2 or Google, right? Same is the case with that, and you're right, Matt. Same is the value proposition from Chronicle. So we believe more and more such things will come to the play where aggregation becomes more of the primary niche rather than that, hey, who has the best encryption mechanisms or who has the best WAF out there, right? From a cloud provider standpoint, Azure will have its own WAF, AWS will have its own WAF. But now we will have a governance control where you say, hey, I want to build an app which needs to be, can be potentially on AWS, on Azure, or on both. Which WAF do I use? I use that third-party WAF, which now is a syndicator, right, or an aggregator, if you will. So some of that really will start happening. Same is the case with network, right? Azure and AWS network security groups and firewalls are now so close to each other, right? That you can really now, a company like Palo Alto can really say that, hey, you know what, we understand this network layer. We will build an aggregated layer on top of it. And behind the scenes, we will provision the more secure versions of AWS Shield or AWS firewalls, right? And Azure firewalls, which is pre-configured. I think if they do it that way, right, they will probably have a larger uptake, right? Because right now the customers are struggling with, I'm able to get AWS firewall at 1/10 or 1/20th of the cost of Palo Alto, right? And right now I want to start off, try this particular app and want to start looking at public cloud. At that time, if Palo Alto is trying to come in and say, hey, or Checkpoint comes in with their own firewall, right? That there is a procurement aspect. There is an aspect where, why do I have to pay you so much, right? Instead, if it is utility based and it is part and parcel of that aggregated value proposition, I think there might be a better way for companies like Palo Alto or Checkpoint Firewall to sell that aggregated value proposition rather than singular value proposition that, hey, you take my network appliance, and that's the only way to go.
Yeah. I think we're going to have to, speaking of AWS governance, we might have to do some ASW governance here. We're getting to the end of our segment. But I absolutely wanted to say thank you, Guru, for coming by. This is a fantastic conversation. Gave us good insight onto aggregating across multi-clouds and what that actually means for both the startups as well as actually DevOps teams that even want to try to start to embrace that model.
Oh, we are very excited about that. Thank you so much, Mike, Matt, and John. Loved it.
Great. Thanks again. Thanks, Matt. Thanks, John. And what we're going to do now is take a quick break, and then we're going to return with news of the week.